Welcome, everyone. We are here for the Building Emotional Resilience webinar with the founder of Us Underneath. And I'm so excited to get this started. Thank you for being here. Thank you for taking out the time to work on yourself. I know that a lot of people are having a tough year, so I think it's so important to take that time out and to really remind ourselves to focus inwards. So today we are going to be talking about connecting to ourselves. My name is Priya Transgard. My pronouns are she and her, and we are joining you from the unceded territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And I'm so happy to be here with Erica Franken today. Before I introduce Erica, I want to tell you a little bit about the company that I founded called Edify Learning Spaces. It is a one-on-one online tutoring company with a strong focus on social emotional learning. Our big belief is that if the tutor, teacher, educator, parent connects with themselves and truly connects with themselves, that they'll be able to make a more meaningful and impactful connection with their child, with their students, and with the overall community. So I think the main thing is that it is for the greater good. This is a social emotional learning skill wheel, and it also includes culturally responsive teaching. Today, we're going to focus on this one part of the wheel called self-management. And one of the things Erica is going to talk about is about resilience and facing that in spite of obstacles. There's other portions here, but we can't get into that. Might take a few years, maybe, but at least Erica is here. Erica Franken, it's been such a pleasure getting to know you, and I'm so appreciative. She is the founder of Us Underneath. She is a professor. She is a conflict resolution specialist. Her background's in law and psychology, and she's also a podcast host for Inside Out. And it's just such a pleasure to have someone like Erica here with us today talking about how we can build resilience. It's been such a tough year, and I know that with your insight that you can help others. But yeah, without getting being too much of a fan, I do want to say it's just been lovely connecting with you, and you're so skillful in your ability to connect. Even though we aren't in person, I feel like you were able to jump through the screen and really hold a safe space for me. And so I appreciate that, Erica, and welcome.
Thank you so much, Priya. Before I share my screen, I just want to sort of tap into some of the things that you shared with Edify Learning Spaces. And, you know, I had to really get an understanding for myself on what social emotional learning was, as you described it to me in our preparations for chatting. And I didn't realize that it was so complex. You know, I was a bit intimidated when you invited me to speak because I thought, like, I don't know how I can connect all of these dots. And you've made it so apparent that it's so complex and it's so intricate. And to your point, this resilience, just this one resilience piece, which, you know, I could spend days on. I'm still learning it myself. It's so intricate in and of itself. And then, of course, there's so many other pieces just under that self-management web. So I think that just speaks to the value that this social emotional learning approach brings, but also, you know, kind of leaves us with the realization of how much we have to learn, and that's everyone. No one's above emotions, right? We all have them, and we're all vulnerable to them, and we're always learning from them. So I'm really grateful that I get to do this work, and I'm really grateful that you invited me along, and it's equally been so wonderful to get to know you, and I'm just so excited about what you're doing. So it is absolutely my pleasure to share this work, and just I want to like sort of suggest before we get started that, you know, anything that I share today, it's my own learning personally, professionally, and I continue to build on both of those aspects. So I don't claim to have any answers, but I certainly have some experience that I think is valuable to reflect on, and my interest is in sharing those questions with others to kind of expand our consciousness around what resilience is and how it can add to our web of tools as we figure out who we are and how we want to spend our life. So
Wonderful.
I will get started.
Thank you.
No problem. I'm just going to share my screen if you'll just bear with me here. Can you see that there?
Absolutely.
Great. So the question that you so skillfully asked is, how do we reach our highest self before we connect with others and our students? And the reason why I love that question is because it sort of grounds us in first looking at what is our highest self. What even is our highest self? And when we look at sort of a visual of what that could be like, we see that what it is. For yourself, you pick an elastic band. You can pick whatever elastic band you want out of that pile. But what I would encourage you to consider before you do is that you can pick the thick, strong rubber band that will, you know, if you pull it apart, pause when it's at its capacity for stretching. Or you can pick the smallest little tiny rubber band that you see there. And when you pull it, you might pull it without any warning that it snaps. If you start to connect these dots to what we're thinking emotional resilience is, you might be more inclined to pick the thick rubber band. Personally, if I'm caught in a challenging situation, I would prefer to be stopping when I'm at my capacity, taking that pause and regrouping instead of snapping. It's hard to come back from snapping, whether that's, you know, a discussion where you snap, whether that's your health where, you know, it's figurative, but if we snap, you know, if something breaks or something becomes a disease, I would prefer not to get to that place. So as we're thinking about this analogy and starting to get a feel for what emotional resilience is, I'd like you to consider the definition that emotional resilience is the ability to be with your emotions without being in conflict with them. So I'll say that again, the ability to be with your emotions without being in conflict with them. It's just there for us in front of us. I think this is a really important thing to hone in on. With your emotions without being in conflict with them. What does that mean? Well, it means that we don't need to be the person who can handle everything. It doesn't mean that we need to be robots. It doesn't mean that we need to spend our whole lives figuring out how to not to be affected by things. We're human and we're here to have a human experience. But the way to do that is to not attach our identity to the emotions that we're having. In my practice in conflict, a lot of the clients that I have, I notice it's a very human thing, I think. And perhaps I've been guilty of this myself, but people think that they are their thoughts. You're not your thoughts. You're just not. And we'll get to a little bit of why that is in a second, but to just hold on to this idea that you can have an emotion and it can have nothing to do with you. It could just be like if you picture a cloud passing in the sky is always blue. We are always the sky. The thoughts, the feelings, the emotions that we're having are like clouds in the sky, and they are very temporal. They'll come and go. So we don't need to go down or up with our emotions unless we choose to. And this is where emotional resilience starts to give us some choice. So, okay, we know that we have our highest self. We know that we have a sort of a vision of what our core looks like. We know that life can challenge that, and that there's this thing called emotional resilience that can help us deal with it. And somehow that means that we get to have the experience but not be attached to it. So let's break this down a little bit further. What do we do with these emotions? I mean, those are 5 basic ones listed in front of you, but most of us would argue, and I'm sure, you know, Priya being in the social emotional learning space, you could name much more than 5. And so how do we deal with that? And how do we know, I guess a sort of a better question is, how do we know which of them is real or just an emotion? And when I say real, I mean us. How do we know which emotion is an expression of the real us or just an emotion? Is there a way to tell? And perhaps another question about that would be, not only is there a way to tell, but is there a way to choose which one we share? Because we can all point to some experiences that we've had where we acted out of anger or sadness or confusion. And it's just really difficult to tell how to behave or how to show up when we don't know where these emotions are coming from. I'd like to sort of get us thinking about emotion in a different way. Emotion, I've broken it up into two parts, E for energy and motion. So if you think of emotion as energy in motion or energy movement, we might start to find it a little bit more palpable to realize that it isn't us. And emotions are instead a snapshot of an experience we are having in the moment, not so much to do with who we are at our core self. So energy in movement. We are permeable beings. We are wired for connection. It's not by accident that if someone is feeling sad on the other side of the room, we are going to feel that ourselves, right? It's just that empathic, basic human experience. So the emotion might not even be our own. And as I'm describing this, I'm really trying to paint the picture for you that we don't need to attach our identity to them. We don't. So let's think about this a little bit more. Okay, sure, the emotion isn't ours. We're having the emotion, it's our experience, but it's sort of ours because we're experiencing it and now we have to deal with it. And so what do we do with that? Well, it's true, they're not ours, but they are sort of a signal. They do sort of offer a signal to where we're at. And one way I'd like to sort of just start to describe that is if perhaps this is skewed more negatively, although I'm not offering the example to think of it, be thought of in a negative connotation, but the canary in the coal mine. And that has a negative connotation with it, but the visual itself I think of as quite fitting. So, you know, we have a subconscious, we have a web of beliefs within that subconscious. And as we start to have experiences on the outside, they might start to mimic some of that subconscious memory below. And so it might trigger something that was quite painful for us to experience at a time. And then just you can picture up in your body an emotion rising up to the top, acting as rather a signal for what's going on inside of you. This can happen whether we're happy, sad, mad, or glad, anywhere in between, right? So it's sort of a signal. You might choose to do something about it, or you might not. For example, when most of us are happy or anywhere on the positive side of the emotion, we don't do anything about it because why would we disrupt that? We all love being happy. Life is good when we're happy. But if we're anywhere sort of below the line where we're starting to feel a little bit heavier, we might want to choose to see what that signal is saying, trace it back, almost like a map, and it is possible to do this. So there's a route back to that core belief, that core memory that's triggering us to have any of the sort of below the line emotions, or even the above the line emotions. But if we're thinking about the below the line ones, we might think of things like angry, upset, frustrated, sad, scared, anything that sort of starts to take away from that best self that we have. And we can start asking questions like, what am I feeling right now? Naming that emotion. Where is this coming from? You don't have to have the answer intellectually. You can tap into your body and find it. You could just point to an organ. You might be feeling it in your stomach. You might be feeling it in your chest. You don't need to know all the answers. Your body is quite a brilliant system, and it can actually direct you to understand this memory or the experience without you needing to know anything about it intellectually. Sometimes they come out of nowhere. Sometimes they truly are based on an experience we had way back. We might have a recollection of them, we might not. Sometimes it's quite objective why we would be feeling the way we're feeling. And this can all this information and data can contribute to us sort of mapping our emotions and understanding where they came from. This is an invitation to you, right? It's not something that you have to do. But if we're talking about emotional resilience, it's really helpful to begin to know where our emotions are coming from. And especially if we're going into it with the belief that we are not our emotions. We're just understanding where they're coming from. People who are quite empathetic, who ring high on the empathetic scale, might find themselves having thoughts, beliefs, or emotions, or all of the above that are definitely not theirs. Oftentimes it's one of the things we do as empaths. We try to shoulder it for other people, and we begin to sort of weave that into our own philosophy about a topic, how we should live out a day, how we should solve a problem. And it's not until we start to reverse engineer where those emotions, beliefs, thoughts came from, that we realize we picked them up from someone else, not for lack of good intention. It wasn't ours. So we really have a lot of questions to ask in this space. And mapping your emotions really is an opportunity for us to, without that much effort, really understand the experience that we're having so that we can get back to that best self. And this sort of brings us to another interesting point. If you think back to those 5 basic emotions, and then you consider all the other ones that you could possibly have, I've been prompted in this practice to learn emotions, and I think there's a lot of value in doing that, but I also think that there's value in stepping out and really looking at it from a higher level. So this 2 in front of you symbolizes what emotions can be tracked down to, traced down to at their basic level. I would say not everyone agrees with this, but there is some thought in the psychology field that emotions can be traced down to 2 basic experiences, one of love and one of fear. One of love and one of fear. So anything below the line, the heavier emotions, it is arguable that the core experience at the center of that is fear. Anything above the line might be love. And so it's not by accident that when it's above the line and it's sourced from love, we feel expansion. We feel ourselves being limitless. We feel ourselves being able to go into things without hesitation, which you could argue is more in line with your best self, your ideal self, your highest self. When we feel that fear-based emotion, the lower level, the heavier, we are operating out of more density. There's restriction from within. It's an inner conflict. We are having a difficult time moving forward or even thinking expansively because there's too much going on inside. It's too scary. The body is detecting fear, and it's actually operating under the conditions that you should be fearful. Some of us might be familiar with the fight, flight, or freeze response. This is a response that your body has internally to protect you when you're operating out of fear. And it is a physiological thing. In fact, after we have a response based on what they call the amygdala hijack, which is a fight, flight, or freeze response, it's been said that our hormone levels are not fully restored until 48 hours after the event or the moment of the experience. Again, we're working on a spectrum here. So if you can picture, mild to severe, you might have a slight experience where you're feeling discomfort or distress. That wouldn't be a full-blown amygdala hijack, but it would be on the spectrum. And so you are not even physiologically operating from a perspective of expansion. The reason why this is important to recognize is because if we're honing in on what that best self looks like, that love perspective looks like this. Whatever that best self was for you looks like this. Anything that's not this is a mild to severe inner conflict from within. And that's not to make it sound harsh, because things are never perfect, right? Things are never 100%. You could be completely in alignment with your best self in your career. And in your personal life, there might be some inner conflicts that are getting in your way, right? And things fluctuate minute to minute, day to day. Nothing is static. So it's never, the goal isn't, if you're ambitious, perhaps the goal is to be, whatever this image is for you as much as possible, which is excellent. But part of having emotional resilience, again, is not attaching your identity to them. So even not attaching your best self to these emotions, and that includes the good ones. I am me. My values are static all along until I develop new ones or start to shift off other ones. But my values are what my values are. And my aim, sort of my compass, is to choose the loving perspective in as many experiences and situations as I can, so that whatever expression of my value is through that love, that's me in that situation, right? My expression of fear in an experience will not be my best self necessarily. So I want to offer you this visual. Of course, it's nature, which is always beautiful to look at. So that's one aspect. But there's something deeper here that I want to convey. When you think about your best self, if you want, you could even take this exercise to a more personal level, and you can do that exercise where you close your eyes and you imagine your best self and write it down. Like, answer all those questions. What conversations would you be having? How would you be making people feel? How would you feel internally? What would you want people to think about you or to know about you if you could choose? What would your legacy be? And as you start to have that description of yourself, you can start to source. If anyone knows what the process is of making maple syrup, you know that when you tap it from the tree, you have like sort of a huge pot. And when you actually boil it down to get the maple syrup, you have very little. You have like this tiny little bit. Do that with your values. Look at that big picture of your highest self. And as you start to think about it, let those values start to purify from underneath. What are the values that are informing that personality of the best self? So then now let's look at this tree. The leaves on the tree could be your personality, right? Underneath the leaves are the branches, and underneath the branches, we all source back down to this trunk. If my trunk is made up of kindness is one of my values, family is one of my values, connection is one of my values. Those are really core values that you can't destroy. They just are. They're not per se tangible. They're abstract, and they're at the core. So I won't destroy those. Instead, I'm going to consider those as my trunk. My life is born from these values. The branches are sourced from those values. The leaves are sourced from those values, and they become expressions of your values. Things can change though. So the values might be there, but perhaps you're allowing energy in or belief systems in that start to challenge those values because of fear, which is a very natural human experience. That's going to become a part of your trunk, which will then inform the composition of the branch and then the composition of the leaf, right? We don't want to try to control the leaves. Those are the outcomes. Those are the byproducts. What we want to focus on is the trunk. What's my core made up of, and how do I show up from that place? So I raised this analogy with someone in one of my workshops, and I was so delighted when they took the analogy even further, which I thought was great. So what they said was, okay, I can see that. And as we start to evolve, those leaves might fall off the tree and go into the ground, and we might come up with new values or changing values that comprise of a different trunk, making different leaves, right? So this is not, there's no opposites here. This is a cyclical, very natural process. We're always evolving. In some situations, people say things like, sometimes it's cruel to be kind. I'm giving you sort of that like extreme example because what love looks like in any given situation will be different. It will be different based on the conditions. It will be different based on your perspective. It'll be different based on the information that you have at the time. But whatever your expression of love is arguably your most authentic self, right? So we don't have to worry about I'm encouraging you not to worry about the little things. I'm encouraging you to consider that you have one of two choices to make in any situation. One is from a place of love, making a decision from a place of love, and one is making a decision from a place of fear. And what can we do about this? What are some tips and tricks that we can use? This one is my absolute favorite. And the reason it's my favorite is because there's no right and wrong here. So if you look at this, there's a lot to observe. And so much to the point that it's almost mesmerizing. One of the reasons why I wanted to share this visual with you in terms of a tool that you can use is because it represents to me the mixedness that is energy around us and within us, and the complexity that it is to be human, and that there's data here, there's information here for you, but it's not for you to control, it's for you to observe. So when we are experiencing that there's a misalignment, when we're experiencing that our emotions, our beliefs, our thoughts are informing us, but they're not completely in alignment with our core self, with our authentic self, we have the opportunity and actually the invitation to just sit and observe. There's nothing for us to do. You are not the owner of your, your identity is not the owner of your emotions, right? There's nothing for you to do but to observe. In fact, it's asking you to be healed. When we give our awareness, we're healing. And that's one of the basic principles of somatic experiencing therapy, which is an amazing therapy that has healed people incredibly with a lot of success. So there's nothing for you to do here but observe. Observe where the heavy emotion is. Observe some of the memories that it's populating for you as you go in. And a good way to do this is to go into meditation. Observe how it's moving, that it's not stagnant. And I promise you, with everything that I know and believe, that if you do this, you will heal it. And you'll move on to whatever next experience you wish to have. There's so much more to talk about there, but that's sort of the high level on that. Another really amazing question that I love to ask is, what can love do right now? I don't know if, I wish I remember the name. It's a Pixar movie. And I remember there's a scene where a building was blown up and it was very sad. And this little character, there's, broken tile, broken everything. And this little character is the child of this family. And they fixed like 2 little tiny pieces of the broken tile. It was the first move that was made after this explosion happened. And the look on their face was just complete vulnerability and an act of love, like an effort to start putting things back together. So, if I'm connecting now to the experience of teaching or tutoring, but even in your personal life, if you're sensing that sort of upheaval of emotions or the misalignment of emotions, it can absolutely be healing in the moment to take even 1 minute. Don't underestimate the power of 1 minute. It can be very healing to step away from 1 minute and to just breathe, just notice your breath. That is a loving thing to do. Or it could be anything. Maybe you have more time on your hands. Maybe you can go for a walk. Maybe you can phone a friend. Maybe you can do some stretching. Pay attention. Over the next few years, there will be more research coming out of proof on how you can release emotions through stretching. I know it to be true through some healing modalities that are already being practiced, but this is something that you don't have to pay $180 an hour for to talk to a therapist. You can jump on your yoga mat or even the floor or the grass and stretch. And I promise you will feel better. Another one would be to journal. So for those of you who like to write, going through those series of questions on where this emotion came from or what you're feeling or where you're at today. Just, you don't have to overthink things. Just put down what is. There's a practice of journaling that people do for like 20 minutes at the beginning of every day, every morning. And it's amazing how much you can clear your mind. Just giving it to a piece of paper and it's no longer yours. Again, the ego is a tough thing to battle with, but it doesn't win, right? So if most of you is of the mindset like, okay, I am not my emotions, and you do as much as you can in your power to kind of let that naturally evolve, the ego eventually has to give over, and it will. It will. And bring this into the classroom. So again, I wanted to highlight the piece around teaching. As a teacher myself, I know it's one thing to just do this for ourselves. It's a whole other thing to hold space for everyone in the room when you have a lesson to get through and you don't know where those your students are coming from in their day, right? Especially during this time of coronavirus where tensions are running high. It's difficult for everyone to find their place of peace. I think you will have a better experience if you bring some of these practices into the room. I do 5 minutes of meditation sometimes with my classes, just at the very beginning. It doesn't take much, but it pays off. And I think having it not be academic is kind of nice too. Students like that because, you know, there's a bit of a resistance sometimes when it can come into when we can come into a space of knowing that we have to just sit and learn, which is great and fun. But if there's any resistance at all, these little practices will take care of themselves. You can do the same thing with the journal exercise, just having students journal for 6 minutes at the very beginning of the session, about whatever they want. They don't have to show you. It can just be for them, and they can throw it out at the end of class. It's powerful. And then I'd like to just leave you with one question, which is, how do your values inform your authentic self as a teacher? So if you have that visual of what your best self looks like, and you already have an idea, you know all these answers already, you already have an idea of who you are in your most authentic best self. How do you see yourself as a teacher imparting this energy on your students and in the classroom? Even if it's virtual, it's still possible. So that might be a question that you want to ponder, or you want to leave yourself with as you go into your next class. And it's not one that perhaps is ever fully answered. It's constantly changing. But I would just like to offer you that your authentic self is at your very core. It's never not available to you, right? You know, we can be affected by things on the outside, and we have tools to manage that, but our authentic self is untouchable. It's always available to us, and it's always accessible. And I think that's all I have.
Wow, that was amazing. There's so many things that I wrote there. You had so much information, theory-based, practical information, things that tutors and teachers could take into their classrooms and their sessions starting today. So there's so many aspects of it. Like I probably have way too many questions, but I think I think some of the main takeaway points that really stood out to me is that that our most authentic higher self comes from a place of love as opposed to fear. And so with my background in psychology, I know those things, and then the other, there's so many sticky points, but I think the other point is that just like the tree, we're not or a cloud in the sky, like we are not our emotions. We are not just our emotions. And yeah, I think thinking of a lens like through being a teacher and tutor, if they're having, a day where they're just their heads above water, they're just managing coronavirus, and they see that a child or a learner is not paying attention. So they're not really harming the tutor in any way, but the tutor starts to get frustrated and annoyed. And then that starts to come out. And it's normal. It happens all the time. So I think a lot of tutors and teachers, they get to that place where they don't take that time for themselves to connect with themselves and say, I need a minute right now.
Well, and maybe the student does as well. There's not enough time to get into how this work affects other people, but there's a whole myriad of conversations to be had around projection, right? So we see the world as it is to us. And that's where conflict practice becomes really interesting, because when you have people who start to sort of diagnose conflicts in other people, you might want to look at how it's true within yourself. Mm-hmm. It's not necessarily, but it's just something to look at, right? So when we start to notice the student isn't paying attention, okay, what's going on for them that's kind of diverted their attention? And sure, it might have to do with something else that happened earlier in the day, but there is a few things that we can do to bring them back here. And so just tapping into them, like, maybe you can tell me about a fun thing that happened in your day today, or tell me what you think about this topic. I mean, that's sort of a stellar one for sure is, I don't claim to have any answers for my students. I have the material understood, of course, as I teach it, but, I know it, so I don't need to be taught it. So I ask questions. And I think when people can start to unlatch that didactic mindset that, we're not speaking to someone, students can do a lot of learning by just being asked questions themselves and making their own connections.
Exactly. I think that's where most of the neural pathways are built, is through questions and curiosity. And curiosity doesn't come when you're fearful.
Right. Yes, that's an
Yeah.
excellent point. Someone that I listen to, his name is Colin Powell, actually. He does a lot of interesting work in emotional resilience as well. I interviewed him once, and he was really fascinating. And he said, curiosity and judgment do not live in the same space. They cannot. And so isn't that interesting, right?
Absolutely. Well, I think you brought up so many wonderful points, and there's so much for us to think about, and exactly what you were saying about, um, you're here with questions, right? So it's up to us to take away from that and to ask ourselves questions. And someone that I listen and read, is Brene Brown, and she often talks about values, and she has a workbook, but she basically says that if you could just focus on two of your core values, that would be, so important. And it really comes back to that tree that you were talking about. I
Mm,
just,
mm.
yeah, I see such a connection between that tree and our brains. And
Oh, interesting.
yeah, even the shape of it. So I
Yeah.
think that's pretty interesting to see all the pathways and all the ways that we could go about learning and being true to our core values.
That's so interesting. I didn't even make that connection, the brain and the tree. That's really interesting.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for joining us today. Us Underneath is a wonderful resource and a wonderful website. So it's www.usunderneath.com.
Okay.
Erica is such a value, such a treasure. I treasure your information. I honor that. And I hope that the people watching today got as much value as I did. And I know for sure our tutors are so thankful and grateful to have that information, um, even if they didn't know it, also as a reminder. So thank you so much, Erica.
Well, thank you for having me. It's lovely to be here. And teachers work so hard, and it really is not, it's a labor of love, that's for sure. And so it's not easy all the time, but it's so rewarding, I know. So I don't think I've shared anything that anyone doesn't already know today, but definitely just even brings peace to talk about it, I think. And I'm available anytime if anyone wants to chat more.
Okay, thank you so much, Erica. I'm going to be ending the recording today. You will be able to see this on YouTube, and I will be sending you a link. Thank you, everyone, for joining us.